Citizens Advisory Committee meeting. We do have a quorum of committee attendees today, and if the committee would be kind enough to call the meeting to order, please.
This is Patty Baltram. I move to call the meeting to order.
This is Ray Connolly. I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. And as a reminder for our committee members, if there is a motion or a comment, if you would please say your name to assist Marcy Watson with the minute taking today. And I would like to acknowledge that we do have a few guests in the audience today. We have our governing board president, Mr. David Sandoval, who has joined us, as well as Mr. Brian Lundberg, Managing Director of Stiefel Nicholas and Company, the bond underwriting firm for the district. And Mr. Lundberg will be assisting us with one of the agenda items later in the meeting. And we do also have our Director of Food and Nutrition, Sandra Sawshow, as well as Mr. Chris Deeg, our Executive Director for Facilities and Construction. And Mrs. Seha Martinez has just joined us as well. So welcome to our guests. And with that, we'll move to agenda item number 2, which is the approval of the April 15th minutes, please.
This is Melissa Briggs. I move to approve the April 15th minutes.
This is Patty Baltram. I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you, and the motion carries unanimously. We'll move on to agenda item number 3, please, which is the approval of the April 22nd Advisory Committee meeting minutes.
This is Annette McCarty. I move that we approve the April 22nd meeting minutes.
This is Patty Baltram. I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, the motion does carry unanimously. And before we move on to agenda item number 3, I should mention that Mrs. McCord is not able to join us this afternoon, so she has been excused from the meeting. And I misspoke, I should say agenda item number 4, which is to review our updated meeting schedule. And Robert, if you would please bring that document up. The committee will recall last time we met, we did add 2 meetings to the meeting schedule. Here's a listing of all of the meetings that we had scheduled to date, including the 2 that we did need to cancel regarding or related to the COVID-19 crisis and the inability for us to meet in person. We did add an additional meeting on April 15th. And then last week we added 2 more, the meeting we're having today, which is April 29th, and a second meeting was added for May 6th, as well as the originally scheduled meeting for May 13th. So I wanted to ensure the committee had that updated list for review and reference. Are there any questions regarding the updated meeting schedule?
This is Patty Beltram. Are you going to send, or is Marcy going to send these appointments for us in Teams?
Thank you. Robert from IMT is helping us with those meeting invitations, and we will get them sent out because we're not meeting in person as we did previously. Marcy will not be sending out the invitations. They're sent out in a Teams live format, so we do ask for assistance from our IMT department, but we'll make sure we get the rest of those invitations out to you. All right, any other questions? If not, we'll move on to agenda item number 5.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last time we met, there was a question regarding the cost of new school construction, specifically related to elementary schools or high schools. And so Mr. Christie did reach out to some of our surrounding districts here in Maricopa County, and he did assist us with compiling pricing related to recent elementary and high school construction. And with that, we can quickly go through the schools that are listed. The first one is from Mesa Unified School District, and that is an elementary school that they've recently completed last year in July, just over 88,000 square feet, and the cost at that point in time was $20,048,960, with a notation that there was around $440,000 that was returned as savings, and $457,000 amount that was for adjacent ways. So the amount as a whole was around $20 million. And then the second school, elementary school, that is on track to be scheduled, or to be completed rather, this summer, is in the Deer Valley Unified School District. And that's a slightly smaller elementary school, just over 83,000 square feet. And the cost for that elementary school is projected to be $16,915,021. And then the third school that we have for reference is a high school, Canyon View High School in Waddell, Arizona. And the cost for that high school is $75,760,000. And that's just under the amount Mr. Barcone referenced during the April 15th meeting when we had the ADM group presentation. You'll recall he had mentioned the average price cost for a comprehensive high school is around $80 million at this point in time. And then finally, here in Tolleson Unified School District, there's West Point High, and that high school was just over $107 million, so a little more expensive than the Canyon View. And it's actually I believe Tolleson Union, not Unified. I misspoke. And Mr. Duguid and Christie, do you have any comments to add to the prices that we've reviewed with the committee, or any comments on the construction aspects of the projects?
This is Chris Deeg. Hello to all. Just wanted to say that yes, your findings and your information is exactly on point with what I found. If you break those down, those elementaries, starting with Silver Valley Elementary, that breaks out to about $226 a square foot. Deer Valley 31 is around $202 a square foot. And those high school sites, Canyon View being $333 a square foot, and West Point being $344 a square foot. So the numbers that we've given in the past are right on point with moving forward in today's moving market in construction.
May we ask a question, Michelle?
Yes, thank you.
This is Annette. Regarding the high schools, does that include the price of land, since land is typically not donated for the high schools?
You know, I did not clarify with them just what's the price of land. I believe these are construction costs only.
Thank you. Chris, one more question. This is Annette again. On the high schools, what were they built for capacity wise? I know the last two schools were Liberty High School and Kellis High School, and the capacity for the architect was 1,800 for enrollment. Do you know the enrollment that they built these two schools for?
I don't, but if you look at current modeling and how we set our schools up, the 200 Canyon View's 227,500 square foot school is a little bit smaller than like a Kellis or a Liberty. At Kellis or a Liberty, around 246,000 square feet. So I would venture to say like a Canyon View is probably slated for around 1,600 students, whereas West Point is probably pushing the 2,500 mark. And again, I'd have to verify those numbers. I do know that West Point opened with, Canyon View opened with a freshman class only. Has anybody on this committee toured either one of these high school sites to take a look at what today's high schools look like?
This is Patty Beltram. I was able to see some of them, but not all of them. Phenomenal.
Okay.
Yes, we did not schedule an official field trip for the committee to tour any of those surrounding newly built schools this spring, so that has not taken place.
Okay.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Deeg or Mr. Duguid regarding the construction costs we've presented?
This is Melissa Briggs. I actually do have a question. Do you have an estimate of what a parcel of land in Peoria would cost for a high school?
Michelle, that might be better answered by yourself. I don't know what the going rate per acre right now is. In every situation varies. As you all know, we just recently got a piece of land that's 13.2 acres called, and it's named the Meadows property at this point in time. I think Michelle could probably speak better to exactly what the incurred costs for those were and how that was broken out.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Deeg. What I'd recommend is we'll bring back some current pricing for the county. The last time we looked at the cost of a land parcel that would be large enough to house a comprehensive high school was when we were evaluating the 2018 bond opportunity. And I'd like to have updated pricing for the committee. We'll bring that back to the next meeting.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Armando Macias. Quick question, as far as the acreage that Kellis and Liberty were built on, do we have any idea how big those properties are?
Yes. Sean, do you still have those figures in front of you?
I don't, Chris, I'm sorry.
Okay, stand by.
Oh, no, the square footage, sure.
No, the acreage.
Yeah, the property size itself, because Canyon is 60 and West Point is 69 acres, so that's a substantial difference in property.
Yeah, I think that our sites are in the 45 to 50 acre range, but I can look it up. Hold on a sec. I have access to that drive.
And just while Chris is pulling that data together, it is a good reminder for the committee that when it does come to new school construction, we typically will receive a donation for an elementary school from the developers that are building housing developments, but the district typically does purchase land. When it comes to SFB funding, that can also include the land portion, but as we've shared at a past meeting, the district currently is not qualifying for school facilities board funding for a high school or land purchase at this time. We do have on the agenda a readdress of prior agenda items. Chris, would you like us to come back to this later in the agenda if you need more time?
With consideration of everyone's time, I think that'd be a wise thing to do. Chris, unless you found it.
I don't have the information in front of me to give you the exact acreage. I can get that, and if we have like a rolling document that we can post the exact acreage. I know it's between 45 and 55 per site.
We can bring that back to the committee at next week's meeting. So why don't we plan to bring the information forward in that manner? Thank you, Chris.
No problem.
If the committee doesn't have any additional questions, we'll move on to agenda item number 6. And I would also like to mention, as we move to that agenda item, we do have our superintendent who has joined the meeting as well. Mrs. Linda Pallas-Thompson is with us. And so for agenda item number 6, there are a handful of reference documents, and we'll start with the first two that Robert's going to pull up. And you'll recognize this from our last 2 meetings. It's the 5-year and 10-year plan document that was published by ADM Group as part of our facility assessment study. And the committee has received it several times as part of the agenda, and I believe everyone has had the opportunity to study it in advance of today's meeting. But the reason why this is a helpful document, it helps prioritize by year projects at our elementary schools and high schools, and included in today's agenda materials as well as last week's meeting, we have a priority and observation document that is detailed school by school, listing out the various types of projects that the facility assessment study identified as being needed to be addressed in the future. And then they also broke out those projects in 2 views. The first is the 5 and 10-year view that we're looking at. And then the second is a priority document. And I don't know if that document actually is up right now, if I'm not mistaken. Robert, would you scroll up to the top, please? Just so everyone can see. So we have the 2 documents for your reference, as well as the observation report. And when we met last time, we talked about transportation needs that have been projected for the next 5 or so years, as well as technology needs as far as laptop replacements and network infrastructure. Mr. Gay and Mr. Triggerboff presented, as well as Mr. Dogood, for the transportation requests. And as we start to look at those components, if you will, to an overall need, that helps us build a possible bond authorization. So we looked at that last time we met, and I'll revisit the dollar amounts. There was approximately, and I'm rounding up, $10 million of transportation needs and $33 million of technology needs. However, Mr. Gay did mention that with the restored capital, some of those items that were included in the $33 million total could be funded from capital. So if you backed out 7 or 8 million from that, you could bring that technology need down to a $25 million figure. But as the committee starts to look at the components of what might include either a critical needs bond or a comprehensive bond, those are the puzzle pieces that are strung together, the technology or transportation piece, as well as the priority projects that were identified in the facility assessment. And then, of course, the question if an authorization is recommended, would include new construction. And we're starting to bring that that cost to the committee from an elementary or high school component, with the land being an open item for next time we meet. But I introduce the agenda item in this way because the question has been posed, okay, with dollar amounts for an authorization, how does that affect the tax rate? And then how does that tax rate reconcile to the tax rate related to a 13% override or an override that has a different percentage? And so we do have Mr. Lundberg with us today to help look at some of the documents that his firm has put together and that we've actually got in an at-a-glance format to foster conversation today, because some of our committee members asked specifically, well, with the varying authorizations, what does that do to the tax rate? But the first question then would become critical needs versus comprehensive bond, one ballot question or two. And so we've got both of these in the agenda. And Robert, if you would go to the at-a-glance document, please. And while he's pulling that up, thank you. I'll also mention last time we met, we looked at the categories that are funded by our current 13% maintenance and operations override. And in today's meeting materials, you have the projected allocation for fiscal year 2020 for our 13% override, which provides $27.8 million of funding each year for our budget. And so to bring the conversation to a tax rate perspective, you'll note, and we walked through this in February, how to read a tax bill and the combination of an override tax rate and a bond tax rate. We talked a little bit about what's commonly referred to as a primary or secondary tax rate. Peoria Unified does not set the primary rate. That's at a state level and is part of the state's funding structure, but the secondary tax rate specifically related to overrides and bonds are voter approved. And so as a quick at a glance, you'll see we've got our tax rate going back to fiscal 19 and 20 to give the committee a point of reference of how our tax rate has come down a bit over the two fiscal years. And back in February, when we had the presentation on our debt limit and assessed valuation of property within our district boundaries, we saw that our assessed valuation has gone up. But then, Robert, if you'll scroll down, please, we can share with the committee, and you have this in your materials as well, the tax rate component of a bond authorization, meaning varying bond authorization limits or amounts. And then if we go to the next page, go down one more, please. Keep going. There we are. You might have to enlarge that last slide. The tax rate associated with a 10%, 11%, 12%, 13%, 14, or 15% override and the associated dollar amount. So I'm bringing together several data points that we've looked at over the last few months. We looked at the override in detail in February, and then we have the updated bond authorization amounts to foster conversation among the committee as you start to make recommendations and decisions related to bond authorization amounts and override percentages. And with that, I'll go ahead and mute to ask if there are any questions from the committee, and Mr. Lundberg can certainly answer questions related to the handouts that we've given that have additional comprehensive data. And we'll also pull up in a few minutes a graph that's very interesting that shows no matter what the actual bond authorization amount, that over time, as we've paid down and are continuing to pay down our existing debt related to prior bond sales, as a new bond would come online because of the structure of the amortization and the assessed valuation of property within our district, that tax rate over time continues to come down. So we'll look at that as well. But I'll go ahead and mute to see if there are any questions, and then we'll continue.
Michelle, this is Patty. Just to make sure, I know that we have items 7 is transportation, item 8 is all day K for today. Can we wait to discuss percentages for override and rates for bond until we've heard those presentations. Sorry, I don't know if my question came through. Maybe somebody else is muted.
I'm sorry, thank you. Actually, I had failed to unmute. My apologies. Those agenda items that you mentioned are not comprehensive presentations today, but rather follow-up items related to requests from the committee in past meetings. An example would be a question on board policy compared to ADE guidelines for transportation requirements. So they're not comprehensive presentations today, but rather follow-up items that we highlighted at the last meeting as being open requests. You certainly have within the agenda the ability to come back to this agenda item as well once we've covered those three agenda items you just mentioned. What the committee has asked for previously is what is the tax impact of certain dollar amounts for potential bonds and override percentages. So we're looking at that at this point in time. It continues to allow the committee to either build a bond authorization with information we've provided over our various meetings, or to focus more intently on an override as far as the percentage, and if the categories were to continue in the manner that they have been in place since 2016. If Robert would like to pull up that reference document, we've included as well. We provided that to you last time we met. So this is an agenda item for conversation. We've dedicated a lot of time in today's meeting where the committee can certainly talk about categories that are in the override, thoughts on the renewal percentage or a new percentage, as well as a critical needs bond versus comprehensive bond, and the impact on the tax rate, since that's been something a couple of our committee members have asked about. So this is our opportunity for you to discuss that at length with dedicated time in the agenda today.
Hey, Michelle, this is Rick Guttridge.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Hey, I do have a quick question for you guys. Are there any statutory requirements on the payback periods on these bonds? In other words, let me rephrase the question a little bit, maybe make it a little clearer. Do they have to be 20-year bonds? Can they be longer? Can they be shorter?
I'm going to ask Mr. Lundberg to help answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Mr. Guthridge. Brian Lundberg with Stiefel. I'll just kind of summarize what the statute says. When voters have approved a bond amount at the November election, the district has up to 10 years before that authority amount sunsets, and so it can sell the bonds in, well, an authorization this large would certainly be multiple sales over that 10-year period. Right now, we've looked at 7 years of sales, and the statute does say, though, that every time you have a sale, you are limited to 20 years for each of the for the amortizations for each of those sales. So if you could imagine that we had sales within 7 years, and each of them had a 20-year amortization limit, technically for a 7-year phase program, you would have 27 years of payments, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure I followed all of that, but the question that I was really getting at was not on the sales side, it's on the payback side.
No problem. Mr. Guthridge, for every time you sell bonds, the statute says you have a limit of 20 years to amortize those bonds.
Okay. So it's an upper limit, but there's no lower limit. So we could go to a 10-year bond payback schedule if there were reason to do that. There's no statutory limit or no statute that says we couldn't do that if we chose to.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Guthridge. I'll also mention, and we spoke about this at the last meeting, there are requirements related to technology equipment, and the amortization timeline is a shorter timeline because it cannot exceed the useful life of the equipment that's being financed. And I don't know, Mr. Lundberg, if you want to add to that at all.
Not at this point, but if there becomes questions about how much technology to bond for and whatnot, maybe we can go further into it at that point.
Thank you. So, Robert, I'm going to ask you to pull up the file that has the tax graphs, if you would, please. Thank you very much. And all of the committee members have received these materials, as well as they are on the district's website. I realize with the virtual format, sometimes the screen is a bit small, and we do appreciate your patience as we do move from slide to slide in this format virtually. But again, to graphically represent what we're talking about as a potential bond authorization amount is considered by the committee with all of the scenarios, and we'll flip through each of these in just a moment. This is the largest scenario, and again, these are just for point of reference. We're not recommending one over the other right now, but to show that be it the smallest amount, which we've presented for discussion purposes, which starts at 75 million all the way up to 250 million. Again, that range is describing more of a starting point of critical needs up to a comprehensive bond. You'll see that with our existing bond sales, our existing amortization that's in place, and then a new authorization or new bonds that would be added, you can see how that tax rate would be impacted over time. And so again, we'll slowly flip through each one. This is the first view with that more comprehensive dollar amount that would be required to have new high school construction and elementary construction. Go to the next slide, please. Now we're at 225. You see that further drops down, and this correlates to the at a glance we just had up. And then the next slide showing the impact for 200 million. Again, the blue is the existing bonds and the gray is, and then again, the next slide, please. 175 million. We'll look at the next one as well, please. 150, you can see the lower the authorization, the more of a drop. And then we have just a couple more, I think 3 more. Next slide, please, or next graph rather. 125 million view here, all again below $1.60 per $100 of limited assessed valuation. And then finally, the next two will be 100. And then finally, the last one should be 75 million. So again, the committee has this for reference. If we now go back to the at a glance, the intent of that, as the committee has conversation, you take the associated tax rate. If we go back up to the top, the first view, and I have this live in Excel, so if the committee wanted to run a scenario, we're providing you with the tax rate related to certain bond authorization thresholds and override percentages. And we can certainly continue this the next time we meet. But we did have committee members ask, how do we correlate that? So this is a mechanism to have that conversation.
This is Annette. So the combined rate, I pulled my property tax statement too and was trying to follow along on the primary and the bond and the override. So our tax rate has actually gone down from 7 to 6.8 number. And that's a win for our taxpayers in the community. So if we were to say, for example, with the override, if we keep the percentage the same, our override percentage the same, that would seem the most important, or I mean, not overall the override, so that is a dollar figure for the override and the tax rate. That's simple. It's when we start talking about the bond and the dollars, is it more important for the committee to think about keeping that tax rate the same, or does the dollar number when passing a bond make the bigger impact? And how do we communicate? Just like when you get a home mortgage, you don't pay off the whole $100,000 on your home mortgage in one shot. You pay it over a period of years, like Rick was making that point on that sale. So I'm trying to work through how do we talk about those things?
Thank you for that question, Robert. If you would go to the next graphic, please, in the at a glance. Left down, please. And I don't know if everyone can easily see this, or if he can enlarge it 1% perhaps. That might be too big. Let's go back. There we are. Back in February, when we met, we did look at the dollar amount associated with an override percentage and the associated tax rate. You'll see the highlighted column, that's a taupey gray color, is our current 13%. And the change, if you will, between percentages per $100 of net limited assessed valuation for a property owner. So again, the difference between the funding and the tax rate is something you can look at by percentage. And again, we're highlighting the 13% because that's what we have. So if the committee wanted to use that as a starting point, you could then consider tax rates associated with varying bond authorization amounts, as that's been noted as a consideration by several of our committee members. So going back up to the reference document at the top, so Robert will scroll up, and we thank Robert for helping us run the meetings. We would be placing in future years a tax rate that's associated with the override, be it a 13% or a different percentage, and then the bond is added to that for a combined total. And depending on the size and the amortization of the bond sales, that can affect the rate. But what we're demonstrating, because our assessed valuation has gone up in the district, our tax rate has come down. And so with that, that combined rate is smaller as well.
This is Melissa Briggs. May I make a comment?
Yes.
So, Annette, I think what you're referring to is on the ballot, when voters are looking at the ballot, when they're looking at the override, it's going to have the override percentage, which is 13% currently, if we stayed with that percentage. And if there was also a bond on the ballot, if I'm correct, it only lists the bond amount. For example, if you were going out for a 189 or 198 or 180, that amount is what the voters are going to see. So if they did not see any other materials related to the election, some of them, the only information they're going to see is what's on their ballot, which is the amounts, which means it would be imperative to communicate the impact on their taxes.
Mrs. Briggs, if I may comment, anytime the district has an election question, there is what's called a voter information pamphlet, and it's prescribed in statute. There's a lot of information that's included, and I'll ask Mr. Lundberg to also add perhaps a comment here in this area, that we do have to show the tax impact of the proposed override or bond for the community, and that pamphlet sent out that includes detailed calculations as well as pro and con statements from the community. So the ballot question itself is a very limited question, and that too is something that we don't control, as well as the position of the question on the ballot. But where the voter really can better understand the impact to their home is the data that's included in the voter information pamphlet that every voter receives.
Michelle, this is Patty. Can I ask another question?
Yes, Patty.
Is this an opportunity because we're discussing tax rates? Could we throw out motions on the bond and override at this time for discussion? Is that appropriate to do so or not?
This agenda item is information only, so we don't have it agendized as action. Also, I should share, and I should have mentioned this when we talked about the updated meeting schedule. On Friday of this week, our governing board is having a study session to discuss the M&O override, bond authorizations, and the facility assessment and utilization study. So that study session, I believe, will provide additional information to the committee as well. So when we reconvene and meet on the 6th, you'll have additional information. The intent today was to foster conversation because we've heard as facilitators, the committee wanted to talk about a variety of considerations and to get a feel for where the committee as a whole might be landing, as well as the tax rate question. So we have, as we've met, we've looked at the current categories in our override. We talked a little bit about there might be options if the committee wanted to suggest the addition of a category or a modification. So we've looked at that as far as the current percentage that we have and the option to renew or change it. And then also, how do you build a bond, be it a critical needs bond or a comprehensive bond? Do you want to look at both or one? And what's the tax impact for both considerations? And so we're trying to bring that conversation to fruition today and to give ample time so the committee doesn't feel rushed.
Thank you for your clarification, and thank you for the additional information that the board will be having a study session. Is that study session tomorrow?
It is Friday afternoon, and it will be published on board docs shortly.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Michelle, this is Rick Guttridge. I wanted to throw out a comment to the committee for consideration. And I know in the past that we have always worried about tax rates as opposed to actual tax amounts. And I would suggest that we better pay pretty close attention to the fact that just because the tax rate remains the same does not mean that there will not be a tax increase on the families here in PUSD. And I think we better put a little bit more emphasis on that perspective, because that certainly is going to have an impact on whether something will pass or not.
And that's a good segue into the consideration of assessed valuations and the relationship between assessed valuations and tax rate. Robert, would you please scroll down, if you would, to the third graphic? So as the committee starts to look at options, and I'll ask Mr. Lundberg to perhaps speak to this slide in detail for me, but we have presented an example of the tax rate related to a new bond authorization and our existing bonds for the variety of dollar thresholds we're looking at, just as an example for discussion purposes. And if Mr. Lundberg would talk a little bit about perhaps the assumptions embedded in that and the amortization timeline as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Robert, for this slide. I think what Michelle is alluding to here is, and Mr. Guthridge is bringing up, that if assessed values grow, even if the tax dollar amount was kept the same, that tax rates would naturally decline, and the opposite is true as well. For these scenarios, we've assumed the growth we know about for next fiscal year, but as far as assessed value assumption for years thereafter, we've assumed no assessed value growth. And for all these scenarios, the tax rate graphs that you looked at, if those were to be payment amounts in dollars, they would all have the similar decline with them. And continuation of the same payment over a couple of years, and decline as well, because we've assumed there's no assessed value growth. And so I think one of the points Michelle wanted to make is that if our bond tax rate right now for this fiscal year is $1.53 per $100 of assessed value, the slide you're looking at that Robert has put up for the various bond scenario amounts there, the first row indicates what the projected tax rate would be for fiscal 22. That's 2 years from now. The significance of that would be when the first payment from the first sale of a successful November 2020 bond election would be. You can see that all of those are below the $1.53 bond tax rate. And as the new bond amount in the scenarios declines, the tax rate in a couple years from now is lesser for the lesser bond amounts as you go right across the page. The second row I put in there, which says tax rate by fiscal 28, I thought was significant, because that is when in our scenarios we assumed all the bonds from the authorization would have been issued. And so you would have payments from all the various sales from the potential bond authority. And so you can see there too that we've been able to, like the tax rate graph showed, enable the tax rate to come down, not relying upon the assessed value, but relying upon decline in payments over the years to have a declining bond tax rate. I wanted to mention the average tax rate just for the new bonds, and this kind of goes to the question a couple of questions ago, where Michelle was pointing out that the ballot question for the override asks for a percentage of the revenue control limit of the district, and the bond, though, asks for a dollar amount of bonds in the ballot question. One of the requirements for the voter pamphlet for a bond in statute is to highlight the tax impact of the average tax rate just for the new bonds. So I wanted to give you a look at that, because that will be prominent in the voter pamphlet, those tax rates. So whether we keep the tax rate for new and existing bonds at or below where they are now, the voter pamphlet will emphasize this average tax rate in the voter pamphlet. In fact, the statute says anything the district communicates to the public after the election's been called has to have this average tax rate in the disclosure. And at the risk of switching a little bit, when it comes to the override voter pamphlet and communications about the potential override, the district has to list the first year tax rate for the override, if that was useful. But again, sorry, switching between bond and overrides. I think I'm going to take a breath there, but hopefully I clarified a little bit that our scenarios are not relying upon assessed value to bring the tax rate down. We are actually, in these scenarios, looking at bringing the annual bond payment down, even with adding the new bonds, because of the way we structured the existing bonds that have already been issued to also decline, thinking about a potential future bond authority. So Michelle, with that, I think I should take a breath, see what questions we might have on that.
Thank you, Mr. Lundberg. So for the committee's reference, we are required in the information pamphlets related to any ballot question that we have to share the tax impact. And so that is communicated and prescribed in statute. Are there any other questions?
Hi, Michelle. This is Annette McCarty. I understand what Rick was saying in communicating to the public when we're trying to pass bonds or overrides the tax rate versus tax amount. My concern is the 10 years ago when our home values tanked, that impacted the school district too based on the tax rate. And I'm a little concerned that the next 2 years, from what I've been hearing from economists and our housing starts and housing sales, that we could see a slide in property values, and how will that impact this discussion?
Michelle, it's Jan. Can you hear me? I've been
Yeah.
having trouble with my computer. Sorry. I had to like leave and come back. So can I ask a tax question for dummies here right now? So let's just say we have a current house that's worth $300,000. And we want to know what the taxes are for bond and override. So we're looking at probably about $860 a year. Am I in the right ballpark?
I'd want to perhaps at our next meeting bring back some at-a-glance examples for you, because you'll recall from our February meeting, it's not the Zillow price, it's not the fair market value, but the assessed value. And then there's a calculation that you go through to actually identify the amount that you would multiply against the tax rate. So instead of verbally doing it on the fly, may I suggest that we bring back some examples. We have actually a property tax calculator that we've published in the past, and that might help the committee see the actual tax impact, if you will, on the assessed valuation of certain properties. And if you look back at your materials from February, I do believe that Mrs. Stein actually did already provide some examples for you, but we can certainly bring that back with these current tax rates that we're looking at. Would that be fair?
Yes, I just think that for an average voter, and I just kind of threw that out there, I'm sorry, I realize that, that for the average voter, if they bought their house for $300,000, they want to know what these, not their complete tax bill would be, because, you know, that's true, but they will want to know per a bond and override how much of those taxes are really for that override and for that bond. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And Robert, if you can bring up, please, it's going to be under agenda item number 6, and it's dated 4/22. It's not the expanded view, but the bond scenarios update document, please. And it was also, I believe, already in this at a glance. We do have, just for quick reference, it's not what you're asking for exactly, Jan, as far as the combined tax impact for all scenarios. If you go up, please. There you go. You'll see, down one, please. Next slide, Robert. The per $100 of assessed valuation impact. So what we'll do next time we meet, we'll actually have that average home price, and we'll bring the tax rate for both the bond and the override into that calculation. But we've provided along the way a mechanism per $100 of assessed valuation, how you can do a quick calculation. And that's in both of the handouts that we have today. To Mrs.
Yes,
McCarthy.
because I think they want to know the bottom line. You know, they know they're going to have to pay taxes on their houses, and they know they have primary taxes, but they do want to know of that tax bill, how much is this bond added to their taxes and how much is the override added to their taxes? Something really simple for, like, say, $100,000 house, a $200,000 house, and a $300,000 house. Does that make sense?
We'll bring that back next week. Thank you.
Hey, Michelle, this is Rick again. If I may, I'd like to go back to the point that Annette just made, because I think that's a good one, about the, I think Annette mentioned that she's hearing economic reports about how there may be a slump in housing values because of the effect of the virus. And I was thinking about that earlier today, and I happen to think it would be just the opposite, that all of these folks who live in these big metropolitan areas are going to move to the suburbs, and that may drive housing prices up a little bit. And I'm not making that statement to pick a fight with anybody. I'm making that statement to make the point that I don't think we know what's going to happen. And because of that uncertainty, I think we need to be a little bit, it's better to err on the side of caution than to presume one way or the other. It's one thing or the other is going to happen. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
True.
The last recovery took about 10 years, and this one will probably take about the same.
With the economic updates that I'm tracking, there is an impact in fiscal 21 and fiscal 22. You'll recall with the economic update that we provided, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, Finance Committee report that came out on April 9th is projecting a $1.1 billion shortfall over 2 fiscal years, with the caveat that there's variability of $500 million in either direction with that, and that additional information is forthcoming related to the impact of this quarter we're currently in and next quarter. So your points are valid. We are in a time of uncertainty with COVID-19, and we all are seeing the headlines, so that is the consideration for the committee as well.
I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to throw out another thing for the committee to consider. Because of the uncertainty, I'm thinking it makes, I'm sure, sorry guys, am I coming across okay? My phone keeps muting me, automatically for some reason.
Thank you. Just for the committee, please, if you just say your name for Marcy's purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Rick again. And what I would like us to consider is, let's take baby steps until we have a little bit more clarity. And I would suggest a smaller bond. And the question I asked earlier of Mr. Lundberg was, if there are any statutory limits on how quickly we can pay off the bonds. And maybe we go for smaller bonds over a shorter payback period, keep the tax rates the same if we can, and play out a scenario along those lines. And then once we have a little bit more clarity, and we've demonstrated to the public that we're doing exactly what we say we're going to do, and the quotes we get for these repairs, that are certainly worthless 10 years out and 15 years out, much less 20 years out, do a smaller bond, shorter payback period, focus on the highly critical needs, and demonstrate to the community that, yeah, we're fiscally responsible, we're doing what we say we're going to do, and then we come back and ask again, because we'll have built back the community's confidence in our numbers and stuff. So I'd like to throw out that idea of smaller bond, shorter payback period.
This is Melissa Briggs. Can I make a comment?
Thank you, Mrs. Briggs.
I would just like to suggest that suggestion is based on the assumption that, for example, new school facilities are not a critical need. And if you're looking at the utilization study that we were presented a couple of meetings ago, I would think you could argue that it is a critical need to take into consideration that in a couple of years, we're going to be in dire straits as far as our student body population and place and seats for all those students, that we should take into consideration the fact that we don't have time to wait a couple of years before addressing the fact that we have overutilized our schools in the north.
Michelle, I would have to disagree with that because what we're doing now is kind of unprecedented in how we're doing school. And moving forward, we don't know that what we're doing is not going to continue. I'm not really quite sure that going back to the kind of school we were doing before is what we're really going to do. And that is going to impact that is going to impact how we use our current schools now and the kind of facilities that utilization we're going to be doing. So, you know, to me, that's up in the air too.
And if this is Rick Guttridge again, and Melissa, if I could speak to your point a little bit, I think that's a legitimate concern. And one of the things that we suggested, not in the last bond committee, which I was not able to participate in, but in the 2018 bond committee, we looked at an expansion of the facilities on the current high school campuses. And I would suggest that that may be something that we need to look at also as a stopgap measure until we have more clarification. And to Jan's point, you have lots and lots and lots of schools, public and private, that are doing things online. And maybe that's something that we need to consider as an option, as opposed to building an $80 million high school, $8 million in computers for those high schoolers, and it's a virtual high school at this point. So I think there are lots of things that we could be thinking about before we make long-term commitments in this kind of uncertain environment.
Hi, this is Patty Veltrum, and forgive me, I'm going to have to put my work hat on instead of my mom hat on. I think we also have to think about how schools, high schools, junior highs are going to have to be proactive in providing the essentially needed occupations, and that does require facility needs. That does require technology needs. You heard about special technology needs. I can't throw the baby out with the bathwater to say that all of education is going to be delivered online. When I know that just this morning going to getting essential supplies, that I run into 3 of our kids that are working out there. And so it's a new environment. However, I wouldn't want to say that just because we're delivering online right now, that is the way that we are going to have to go, especially for career and technical education for the future, and preparing our students for industry certifications and associate's degrees that are going to take them to being a productive contributor to the economy. Just wanted to throw that out. So anyway, I know that we can do mixed platforms, but we're still going to need a uniform to teach welding, to teach construction, automotive, to do our nursing program, medical assisting. I mean, I could keep going on, but I won't. But I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Correct. Patty, this is Jan. I totally agree. And when I meant going forward, we were not going to be going back to normal. That was part of my not going back to normal, is now that we know what an essential worker is, we are lacking in terms of, in our country, of preparing our kids for those essential work, like welding, like trades, like those things. And we have so tried to prepare them for going to college that we haven't really equipped our high schools to prepare them for other kinds of work, which is just as important in our society as those kids who go for some kind of a degree. So yeah, we need to rethink how we do school, period. And in rethinking how we do school, we need to rethink how we utilize the schools that we have.
Hi, this is
Kurt.
This is Kurt Hobbs. Michelle, I just wonder if all this discussion that we're having in the last couple minutes is really outside the purview of this committee, because I was looking at your comment from the last comment from the last meeting, and it says that when I asked for that enrollment documents related to variances, you said that you wanted to remind the committee of the scope and another future committee would review utilization, boundaries, and related options. So to me, that sounds like that the ideal of additional facilities is really outside the scope of this committee. And really all we're asking for is how do we actually allow this school district to survive as far as safety and critical needs and in this next bond and also related to the M&O. So I'm confused. So are we talking about utilization or are we not talking about utilization?
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. Yes, throughout our meetings this spring, we've talked about the scope of the committee. And the scope of the committee is to make a recommendation for a bond and or override election in November. And with a bond, it would have an associated dollar amount, and an override would have a percentage. I think where sometimes the committee has tried to expand its scope is when there have been conversations about closing schools or repurposing certain schools within the district or modifying the purpose. I think that's where I've reminded the committee that boundaries and repurposing schools or possibly closing the schools, as folks have brought those things up, that's outside of the purview of the committee. What the committee could do is certainly make a recommendation for a critical needs bond that would be separate from a bond that would have new construction, because perhaps there's additional work that needs to be done by a future committee on our current utilization and boundaries and things like that, just to make that connection. But I think where I was trying to remind the committee of the scope is this committee's purpose is not to recommend a school for closure or to adjust boundaries. In regard to agenda items, this is a very broad agenda item that includes bond authorization amounts, M&O override percentages, tax rates, and related information and discussion. Your question on variances, I believe, was addressed last meeting in the request for future information agenda item, and I believe you were able to ask for that at that point.
This is Annette McCarty.
Oh, just Annette, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh,
but this
go ahead,
is Kirk,
sorry.
Kirk. So I just want to clarify, Michelle, that you're saying that we will get the information about the variances in those I guess higher populated, higher enrollment schools.
You had that as a request, and it was noted as a request, and it's in the minutes.
No, but I'm saying, are you saying we will get the information, or you don't know, or?
It's in the request for future information. We've noted that request. I'm not saying you won't get it. I just don't have that agendized today.
This is Annette McCarty. The number of questions, I'm wondering if we can increase the number of questions on the ballot. I understand in the past we've talked about the various types of funding, and I think there's an additional one called a capital bond. Could we look at one, the override as one question, two, the bond as for the critical needs on building repair? And is there the possibility then of a third question being a high school and or elementary new construction, so that we separate those questions and allow the public to vote as they wish?
I believe that's the approach the committee took in 2018 when you were discussing options, that was considered, if I'm remembering correctly, to have a new construction option and a non. Ultimately, that's not how it moved forward, but I know that the committee in years past has delineated the question in that way. Ms. Lindbergh, do you want to share with what you've seen with ballot questions? Have districts ultimately brought it forward in that manner where there would be a question that separates new construction, if that's what Mrs. McCarty's asking?
Thank you, Michelle. Ms. McCarty, we have seen that in the past, and I think, but it's pretty rare. The ones that come to mind are the way that the districts divided it up. Were to have a second question if it was something a little bit controversial, like a pool. Remember, Agua Fria did that. They made that a second bond question. It hasn't been done that much, and I can't tell you that I think that it's been divided in the way that you suggest in my memory. It usually kind of came down to either something like a pool, which is a little more controversial, or just the level of taxes, whether they wanted the additional amount. And there's just not that many of them. And I don't remember any of them over the last 20 years, I guess, being divided up that way. Doesn't mean you can't.
Thank you.
Michelle, this is Melissa. Can I make a comment, please?
Yes, thank you.
So I just wanted to go back and address two things that came up. The first one is, I think that when the option of trying to simply add classrooms to existing high schools, the committee needs to keep in mind the fact that there are general use areas that are not expanded simply by adding classrooms. The lunchrooms, the auditoriums, the gyms, all of those, the parking lots, all those spaces will not be, the overcrowding for those spaces is not addressed by simply adding classrooms. And I have had 2 children at Liberty, and I can tell you what the lunchtime scenario is. And if it's too hot of a day or if it starts raining, there is literally nowhere for those kids to go. So that it has to be taken into consideration, the general use areas. And then I wanted to address the online school issue from a parental perspective, because I do have 4 children that are currently doing online school at my house. And from talking to them and helping them through their homework and talking to other parents, I can safely say that the majority of parents are not going to be agreeable to the option that we offer just online instead of more facilities. That most parents would agree that this is not an optimal solution, that they, if they have their choice, that they would not choose to be online.
Agreed.
This is Jan.
Michelle? Oh,
Not,
sorry.
I'm not in the,
Our online format, I believe Jan had a comment and then a second committee member. I didn't pick up who that was, but if we can let each person speak in order and identify your name, please.
Go ahead, Jen. This is Armando. Go ahead.
okay. I'm not the proponent of online school. I am just saying that and it's not optimal what we're doing now. Let's just get it out there. It's not optimal for me. It's not optimal for kids. But I am saying that this learning, I don't think is going away. And how we optimize it to better meet the needs of kids and better meet the needs of what they actually want to do later on, that might be something to talk about. That's not something we're going to talk about here, but it's related to the fact that physical space, we don't have that physical space right now. How much physical space we're going to actually use in the future if distance learning either synchronously or asynchronously still happens, will impact how much physical space we actually use and how much physical space we'll actually need. That's really my main point. What we're doing right now isn't really what online learning is in my mind as an option. That's not what I look to the future as being what we're doing now.
So as a point of order for our group, perhaps taking those comments, unknowns with future requirements related to online learning and those types of considerations, that may direct the committee to talk more about critical needs when it comes to a bond authorization amount versus new construction if there are unknowns in that area. just to be mindful of the agenda, and thank you for that comment that we're not trying to fully address online learning as part of this discussion. Armando, I believe you had a comment, sir?
Yes, what I wanted to mention to the committee is that I think we're getting a little bit too focused on the what ifs. Michelle, after today, how many meetings do we have left?
We have 2 meetings scheduled after today. And the
Okay.
next time we meet, you will have input from the study session, which was an open item, a request from the committee for input from our governing board. So I believe the committee will have that as well to consider. I think the essential conversation that's taking place from the committee is important for everyone to feel that their perspective was shared and heard. And as we've facilitated these meetings along the way, we've pointed out some critical considerations. The first is there's a clock that's ticking related to our override. And with that, if that override is not renewed on November 3rd of 2020, we will be put in the position of reducing our budget over the next 2 years in excess of $9 million in fiscal year 2022. Another 18 the year after that, and then our override's fully eliminated. So we'd be reducing our budget over that timeline by $27.8 million using this year's budget as an example. So that's a consideration, meaning if there isn't a recommendation related to the override, there's a guaranteed outcome. So that should be a consideration. The second piece would then be 2 questions versus 1. And we know last year with the input from the consultant that spoke from High Ground, we had actually 2 consultants that spoke to the committee. For those returning members, there was the comment that 2 questions versus 1, 9 times out of 10, a bond question will pass and an override will not. So these are factors that the committee needs to consider as you finalize a recommendation, because we know there's a certain outcome for the override if it's not renewed. With the bond, with opportunities with that, there is additional time if the committee were to recommend a future question, future election, or to, as some of the committee members have referred to, have a smaller critical needs question versus the comprehensive bond, as there's additional future work to do related to the facility assessment and utilization study and next steps that another committee would take the baton and work with administration on.
Okay. The comment that I wanted to make is that I know that everybody's, the point that everybody was making is valid, but because we're up against this time constraint, I really feel that we need to start focusing our efforts and our thoughts into more of a plan of action as far as how we are going to approach this by the end. So I would like to suggest that we start thinking about how we're going to, and everybody made some great points, and the biggest unknown here is how this coronavirus is going to affect us a couple of years, 5, 10 years down the road. So even though it's a valid concern, I think we really need to start focusing on what we're going to ask our community members to vote on, and whether it's one or the other, whether it's 1 or 2 questions on the ballot, things like that. Instead of trying to bring more into it, I think we just need to, I would like to suggest that we start focusing our efforts in trying to make a determination as to how we're going to approach this. What's going to be the best strategy for this? Thank you.
This is Annette. Oh, Rick, do you want to go ahead?
No, I think it was someone else, but I want to make a comment, but I'll let you guys go first.
I guess I just want to add to what Armando was saying, and I agree with him. And I think maybe I'm not certain where I should put this comment in, but I'll add it in that I think that we should provide some real broader questions to the committee, meaning that what questions are we trying to answer with this committee? You know, what exactly are we trying to do? Because there's so much to consider. There's so much information that I feel like that we're not moving forward with the limited amount of time we have. So maybe some very broad questions about, you know, are we trying to decide? Is one of the questions we're trying to decide, is it override um, and a bond? Is it or just one or the other? And the other question, and I'm just sort of just, you know, talking hypothetically here, but the another question could be, you know, what kind of a bond are we looking at? Are we looking at a critical needs bond or a growth bond? And 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 sort of just really lay those questions out very clearly and try to answer those questions so we can stay focused.
Thank you. And when we address requests for information and future agenda items under number 12, we can certainly craft what those questions could look like the next time we meet, because I know our governing board would certainly, I believe they would like to have 2 meetings to start considering the recommendations as well. Our next governing board meeting is May 14th, and we know that a decision has to be made by the end of May for the district to work with the Maricopa County election timelines that we have starting in June. So Mr. Hobbs, if you'd like to perhaps with the rest of the committee to speak to what that agenda item, question, action item, I know Dr. Beltram had that as well. We can certainly add that. As far as the general conversation today, again, we've now over the course of many meetings, we've brought forward information that can help the committee identify a critical needs bond authorization dollar amount. We do have a couple of open items for next time related to new construction, specifically the cost of land. But once we provide that helps provide the additional information on what a comprehensive bond might look like. Again, reminding the committee we have a sense of urgency related to our override, because if it's not renewed, at a minimum renewed, we face budget cuts in fiscal year 2022. Before we move on, are there any other general comments on this agenda item or questions for Mr. Lundberg specifically related to the tax rates and some of the information that we shared with the graphs showing the amortization and payback of certain bond scenarios?
Michelle, this is Rick Guttridge again. First, Annette, did you have a comment you wanted to make before I jump in?
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to say to Melissa and to Patty and to Jan, I agree with the comments that you're making. And I think they address the bond concerns more than anything else. I don't believe online learning is the optimum way to teach kids. So when it comes to that option, we need to think our way through that a little bit more. And to Patty's point about the career and technical stuff, clearly that's a hands-on, in-person kind of an activity that you have to have. So we got to figure out how to do the spacing and all those kinds of things and what those facilities look like. And then the third point is about the Mr. Hobbs has brought up was, we don't know what our capacities are at our schools without looking at the utilization data, and that's not the purview of our committee. And I think all of those things combined kind of point us towards, okay, we probably can't do a whole lot on the bonds, or it doesn't make sense to do a whole lot on the bond side right now. Maybe we should, to Armando's point and to Kirk's point, focus more on the override issues. But like I say, I wanted you guys to understand that I'm not particularly advocating a position with respect to utilization issues, but I don't think we know enough and have enough information, nor do we have the time to really make a solid recommendation to the governing board for any kind of long-term solutions.
This is Annette. I'm a little bit frustrated. The amount of information last year and the year before, our committees had asked for the utilization study, which the district followed through on. And part of what prior year committees, the reason we wanted those utilization studies is because how can we go out for a bond if the district is actually considering mothballing or reducing? You know, we're looking at the utilization to say, do we need the number of elementaries that are underutilized and then those repair dollars versus the overcapacity and the growth that's been occurring in our district in the various pockets, north and south. 6 out of 7 of the high schools are at or over. Liberty is at 130%. They're continuing to build out here. It is, we are stepping in it because we didn't plan ahead of time. And so now we can't just add on modulars up at Liberty because we don't have the general use areas and the hallways are a fire trap. So at this point, I think I've got a lot of, I don't think it's a bad idea to go with the critical needs bond on the ballot, to stick with our existing override. And I'm starting to lean towards, can we ask the voters for that capital construction question and have an additional question?
We can certainly, when we have the request for information and future agenda items, the committee at that time can help identify the wording of any potential action items you'd like to have the next time we meet. Just as a quick final reminder before we move on to the next agenda item, we did have a presentation from Applied Economics that included a lot of data regarding demographics and enrollment projections. That information should be considered in conjunction with some of the data sets from the facility assessment utilization study. And we've shared through the course of the meetings that there are next steps that most likely will be taking place regarding the data that was in the report. So with that, I'll go ahead and ask if there are not any additional comments or questions. We'll move on to agenda item number 7. And I'll have Robert pull the agenda back up. And this is a follow-up actually to an open request that was presented in February. And we've provided several updates on transportation requirements. But the open question that we had, it was three-pronged. And Mr. Dugood's going to respond to the first question that had been posed that we didn't have a response for. And then I believe we had the 2 meetings that were canceled and items have been tabled. So we're bringing that back now. The question was, is there a limit on the miles that a bus can travel? If I'm paraphrasing that correctly, and I'm going to ask Mr. Dugood to respond to that, and then I'll add 2 additional points under this agenda item.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michelle. In short, the answer to that is no. If you remember last week, you look at our age of our fleet, it was almost right down the middle, 50-50, from 2013 on up to 2002 is our oldest vehicle in our bus fleet. But I just want you guys to know how much safety, how many safety checks go into each of our times a bus driver gets on the bus after it's sat. There's a 30-minute safety check that is conducted. I've actually been a part of that as the driver goes around each and every part of the bus. Also, our buses are checked annually by the Department of Public Safety. So To short answer, you think of it as your own car sometimes. No matter what you do with regard to preventative maintenance, which also happens across all of our bus fleet and our white fleet. Sometimes things break down and buses and white fleet have to be decommissioned. But I think it was Mrs. Briggs that asked that question. But in the short answer that I answered in a long way, Mrs. Briggs, is no, there's no set mileage.
Thank you, Mr. Duguid. And Mrs. McCarty had an open question from a past meeting, and that was, does the district have requirements for transportation or transporting students in policy? Is it ADE guidance or statute? And the response is it's actually all three. And for the committee's reference, we do have copies of the ADE guidance and the two main policies from district policy that govern our requirements related to transporting students. So we wanted to follow up with that. And then Mr. Guttridge had a question earlier as well regarding the percent of M&O expenditures or our budget that goes for transportation. And the response is 4.34% of our M&O expenditures are for transportation purposes. Are there any questions on those follow-up items that we've provided today?
No, but this is Jan. I have a question for Mr. Duguid about something else regarding buses. Are they being used right now for any kind of deliveries like food or other things like that during this time?
That's a great question, Jan.
Mr. Duguid, I don't know if that falls within our agenda item. If you want to ask that as a follow-up agenda item for next week.
So I have a follow-up question, and the follow-up question is are our buses, do they have Wi-Fi and can they be used as hotspots? So those are two follow-up questions for him.
If you'll bring it up, please, under agenda item number 12, please.
I will.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any other questions on those follow-up items that we had?
Michelle, I just have a quick question. This is Armando. That percentage you gave, what was it again?
4.34%.
Is that yearly?
Yes, that was it from fiscal 19. The maintenance and operations expenditures related to transportation were $9,922,219, which was 4.34% of the total expenditures of $228 million.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, we'll go ahead then and move on to agenda item number 8. And this is also a follow-up question from a prior meeting. And the question that was posed, it was two-part, and I apologize, I'm not recalling off the top of my head the two committee members who asked these questions. We can look back in the minutes. But the first question was, when did the state reduce funding for all-day kindergarten? And I can share that during the fiscal years of 2008 through 2010, the additional weighting and funding related to kindergarten funding was reduced. So that was the timeline. And then the next question was, what did we use to charge when we charged for all-day kindergarten? And the response is, we had a $1,750 annual cost that was made in 10 payments of $175. We did have discounts for siblings, and there was a $35 registration fee. Are there any questions on those follow-up items? Hearing none, we'll move on to agenda item number 9. And this was a question that was posed several meetings back as well, and it was regarding wellness requirements. And I'll ask Mr. Duguid and Mrs. Sashow to speak to this agenda item. Thank you.
Well, again, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to ask Mrs. Sashow to go through this with everyone. As you may or may not know, she is an amazing employee of ours and a great director, and has done a ton of work since this COVID-19 piece has occurred to us. So Mrs. Shasau, if you could take it away and just speak to this agenda item, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, the local wellness policy, it was part of the 2010 Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. The big part of it was to promote wellness, not just looking at school nutrition, but looking at nutrition education, physical activity, fundraising, marketing, what kind of message are we giving to our students? Our district adopted the ASBA's standard policy, and then, but each district has a committee, and that committee goes through and sets specific goals for the district. And our focus that we've been doing, we're year 2 of the 3-year goal, is looking at increased access to breakfast and then increased access to after school meals. And by doing that, yes, it helps on funding for us, but it also helps, more importantly, that kids have food no matter what their needs are. Another big focus of ours is providing nutrition education resources. We're such a large district that we can't be in every single classroom. So trying to get those resources up there so teachers can grab a brain break or for activity or some sort of nutrition level information. We've also done a lot with the sports teams, but you can find the actual policy in our board policy, of course, but it's also posted on our food service website for parents to see. You can also see more of the specific goals that we're working on and kind of the assessment, how we've done school by school according to those goals. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. If there's anything specific you want to hear, I'm welcome. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mrs. Oshow and Mr. Dogood. If there are no questions, we'll move on to number 10, public comment. Even though we're meeting virtually, we do have a mechanism for our community to provide comment, and Mrs. Watson does have a number of comments from the community that she will read at this time. A reminder for the committee, we cannot respond to the comments directly or comment on them other than they're read for the benefit of the group as a public comment. And with that, Mrs. Watson, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. This is Marcy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll read the first comment from Tracy Grist, and her comment is, what are the plans for the overutilization of Liberty High School? Liberty is now at 130% and more housing is planned for construction. This is not fair to these kids, and if funding continues to be cut and bonds and overrides are not passed, the Liberty kids are being packed in like sardines, not to mention programs like music may be cut. My son is in choir, and this newly formed group is doing a phenomenal job. Truly talented instructor and kids. Many of us do not want to see these programs end. The next comment is from Devin Updegraff Day. His comment is, if the school bond fails to pass, is there a plan in place to fix worsening conditions in our schools? Is the school board open to adjusting the budget, closing an outdated school building that has low capacity, and use the money saved to upgrade outdated school buildings that are in need of renovations and/or build a new school? The next comment is from Andrea Moore. Her comment is, as an educator and parent, I would love to see plans for a new high school to elevate the already crowded Liberty. Next comment is from Michelle Peony Jones. The far north Peoria is in desperate need of a new high school. There are thousands of family homes going in from Deer Valley to Vistancia, yet Liberty High School is the northernmost high school in the district and is already at/above capacity. We need another high school. The next comment is from Deborah Herthel. Liberty is overcrowded and more new neighborhoods keep getting built. The number of people building here are going down. The next comment is from Sarah Service. Peoria specifically Vistancia area, needs another high school as Liberty is at max capacity and over 500 plus homes are being built that will filter to Liberty. Previous proposals are unrealistic to bus Vistancia kids to further south as they are already getting picked up for the bus at 6:25 a.m. to get to Liberty on time. The next comment is from Kate Dinge. Her comment is, I strongly believe that going out for both a bond and an override will cause both to fail. This economy is not going to make citizens more willing to up taxes for the sake of schools. I feel that a bond completely slated for a new high school would have the best chance of success. It is a very qualitative thing to discuss overcapacity rates and growth rates. You might be able to convince the voting public of this need and sway the moderates to the district's benefit. The next comment is from Jen Garbett. District needs a new high school. The capacity in North Peoria is too high. Kids are impacted by this in so many ways. More limited learning opportunities, inability to get classes or electives because they are too full, less opportunity for participation in sports, clubs, and too much competition to stand out academically. We chose this district and high school for the value of education our children would get and are sorely disappointed at the many ways the overcrowding has held them back from the social and academic high school experience they should have. The next comment is from Leslie Hatch. We desperately need a new high school. I'm in favor of a bond and override to accomplish this. My daughter will be in high school in 2 years, and I do not want her rezoned and bused somewhere further away. We were so close to passing it last time, and I think that with more residents moving in every day, we can pass it this time with the right action and promotion. Please fight for a new high school in North Peoria. Liberty is too full, and my kids will not have the opportunities that previous students have had due to overcrowding. I would hate for a pandemic to cause this to get swept under the rug. Vistancia is building more homes, and this will cause major issues if a bond and override isn't passed. Thank you. The next comment is from Bryce Eglin. North Peoria has so many kids that it desperately needs a new high school to handle all the kids. We don't want our kids going to an impacted school, nor a school that's really far away or even out of the district. The next comment is from Stacy Bundy. Please add a high school in the North Peoria area. The area of and near Vistancia, North Peoria, is growing and full of families that currently have high school students and many more that will be of age in the coming years. This area is very popular for young families, and development of additional homes continues. Overcrowded classrooms are a problem and needs to be addressed now, especially with the growing concerns we face with health and infectious diseases. There is also a safety issue with having students travel over 6 miles one way on busy streets for school and school events. As I'm sure you are aware, busing transportation provided by the district is not always reliable and students suffer. Please make adding a high school in this area a top priority. The next comment is from Nicole Dees. 85383 would be like a bond for a new high school. There are way too many kids at Liberty and Sunrise Mountain. Thank you. The next comment is from Kara Cochran. Her comment is override/bond for a new high school in North Peoria. The next comment is from Angela McGowan. I am a long-standing resident of Peoria. I am very concerned that if a bond is not passed to update the current Peoria schools and provide the much-needed high school that North Peoria needs, it will have dire consequences on my children as well as others who live in my community. I currently have a son at Liberty who has autism. The mass crowds seen at this school and bus system has a negative impact on his attitude towards school. I have a current 8th grader who will be promoting to the high school who is very stressed after hearing what her brother says about school. I would very much appreciate seeing the bond added to the ballot so we can get the much needed updates. Thank you. And the last and final comment is from Michael Gard. We all understand the difficult position PUSD is in with PUSD is in with current funding and the impact that is trickling down to our students, and how the students will be impacted even greater with additional decreases in funding. As a committee, you are charged with making a difficult decision and determine what you feel the voters may vote yes for in November, in addition to meeting the needs of the district. The district is in a position it must go out for both an override and a bond election. Arizona has continued to reduce the funding, and there is a worry that this pandemic will cause even more reduction to education funding because of the decrease in state revenue. Additionally, the district uses funding from voter-approved proposition to add to current salaries in the district. These funds come from sales tax revenues, which will also be down due to the pandemic. The committee needs to make the difficult decision to go out for an override increase again. This voter cycle to protect current funding levels and have the ability to provide additional funding where needed. In addition, a bond must also be on the ballot. Many of our older schools need attention. This is what a home realtor would call curb appeal. Yes, the HVAC and technology systems need repairs, but the voters don't see those funding expenditures. We must have funding for the public of the schools, including classrooms, to get updates and be able to show voters the positive use of the voter-approved funds. Additionally, schools are becoming crowded in some areas of the district. It is time to be realistic and propose the funding for the one new elementary and one new high school. The students should not be crowded into schools and have limited options. The building of new homes is not going to stop. The new large housing community is getting ready to open at the corner of Deer Valley Road and Lake Pleasant Parkway, in addition to new housing being built in the Vistancia area. There is a reason the city of Peoria has to put so much money into expanding Happy Valley Road. They see the growth and know what's coming. We must keep up with it within the district. In previous discussions, the traditional school was a discussion. Possibly turn the new elementary into a standalone traditional school with room for growth, which will hopefully compete with the charter schools and bring students back into the district while also saving new ones from leaving. There is also discussions currently about the concerns of low enrollment in some elementary schools in other parts of the district. This could be addressed by expanding the traditional school model into one of these schools that are currently low enrollment and make the difficult decision to combine two schools to create this space for a traditional school, which would require some bond funding to address classroom needs. There is a reason Deer Valley Unified has decided to open a traditional school this fall, and other surrounding districts already have.
3 minutes, please. Thank you. The 3-minute timer just rang, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do keep our public comment to 3 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That was the last comment.
Thank you very much. All right. With that, we'll now move on to agenda item number 11, which is revisit prior agenda items. Is there any prior agenda item that the committee would like to revisit? Hearing none, then we'll move on to requests for information and future agenda items. And for the committee members who commented earlier, if you'd like to revisit your requests at this time, please.
This is Patty. I have 2 future agenda items. One, we'd like a report on what the board study session and board direction outcomes are from Friday's meeting. And number 2 is I'd like to have an additional agenda item at the next meeting so that we can actually make motions for bonds and or override, so that we can actually start talking about percentages for override and what the bond or bonds will entail.
So this is Jan. My question for Mr. Duguid would be, what additional use do our buses have now during this coronavirus period? And is are the buses equipped with Wi-Fi, and are they used as hotspots for areas that lack the internet?
Are there other requests from the committee?
Yeah, Michelle, this is Rick Guttridge. I think I would like to ask if we can see what the tax rate impact would be to go to 15 and or 10-year bond paybacks instead of 20-year bond paybacks.
Okay, thank you. Are there other requests?
I guess I'd like to, this is Annette, sorry. I guess I'd like to follow up to Rick's question, since it is, since we do have Brian Lundberg here, I think still, his expertise on shortening, what does that mean to shorten those terms?
Thank you. Yeah. The obvious is that it would, save interest costs to shorten everything up. And if I might work with Michelle to have some discretion on whether we do something in between to try and avoid increasing the tax rate from its current level, but it would have the effect of increasing the tax rates over the scenarios that we've seen. But in order to be complete, we'll definitely run 10 and 15-year scenarios. I guess the question beyond that would be, what sort of amount of bonds could we anticipate in the, 7 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and would we want to leave room for those potential bond authorities in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Lundberg. The comment that's being made is, with the request for the agenda item, I believe Mr. Guttridge is revisiting the notion of small bond authorizations with a rapid amortization. But the question that has to be answered with that is, what is the volume of those small bond authorizations as they would then relate to an ongoing amortization and the effective tax rate?
Yes.
So we can certainly, I'll work with Mr. Lundberg and we'll have example scenarios, as well as I did make a note, and to dovetail with that, there was the request on an example of the tax rate for an average home with a combined override and bond authorization. And so I've noted that as well to have next time we meet. Are there any other questions or requests rather?
Yeah, this is Melissa. I'd like to make a request. I would like to, from the district, to get the input. If we go for a 13% override, which is a continuation of the current override, I know that the last time we went out for override, we asked for 15%. If we continue with only a 13%, what are we losing in terms of services that 2% that you asked for last time would have covered?
We can have on the agenda a revisit, if you will, of the November 2019 bond question. Is that what you're asking in the category, or excuse me, override question, pardon me, and the categories that were associated with the 15% override? Is that the request, Mrs. Briggs?
Yeah, that is the request, because we keep discussing that probably we're looking at a 13%. So I'm just curious from the district's budgeting viewpoint, what that 2% that we would be leaving out, what programs or services would that mean that we are not covering?
Are there other requests from the committee?
Hi, this is Kirk Hobbs. I wanted to ask for a number that represents, a bond number that represents the priorities that were, I think were site-based priorities in addition to that, the technology needs and the transportation needs, what would be the total if we just tried to go out for a bond that met those three areas? How much would that bond be? And I also, and I apologize for not being able to put this into more articulate terms, but I do believe that we need some critical questions to answer that would outline the purview of this committee to help us stay focused. What questions are we trying to answer? Because I'm afraid that with the limited time we have left, that we probably are not going to really have enough time to maybe answer those critical questions. So I don't know if that's something that Michelle, that you could put together, or that's something that we need to work on, but I would recommend that we have something like that. And I also would like to ask for the applied economics report. I wasn't at the applied economics meeting. I'd like to ask for pages 55 and 56.
Thank you. Are there any other requests?
Michelle, if I may, this is Rick Guttridge. I want to go back and maybe clarify something so we're not putting so much work on you guys. That with respect to a shorter duration, faster payback on the bonds, obviously the tax rates and the out-of-pocket tax expenses will go up if we're talking about a comprehensive bond. So I think you guys can, if that's something that makes any sense at all at any point in time, it's going to have to be restricted to probably just critical needs. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time on the high end of the bond numbers, but just keep it to what you guys think might be a critical needs bond or something in that ballpark, just to save you guys a little bit of work. And to Mr. Lundberg's question about if we were to pay the bonds off, on a faster schedule, what capacity would we have for future bonding for a high school or anything else in the future? I think that's an excellent question, and I don't know that I have a solid recommendation for you, but I think that's something that you guys should consider. So, Michelle, I'll leave that up to your discretion as to what you think might make the most sense at that point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional requests? Okay, well, hearing none, before we move to agenda item number 13, which is adjournment, I would like to say thank you to Mr. Lundberg for joining us today and for the information he has shared, as well as our district administrators who have also joined the meeting to provide information and to answer questions. And with that, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Well, I'll certainly make the motion. This is Rick Guttridge. I move we adjourn the meeting.
This is Armando. I second.
Oh, okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Right, motion carries. We'll see you next week. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you, Michelle.